The lights were hot, the cameras rolling, and the air inside the soundstage smelled faintly of gunpowder and sweat. Brandon Lee, pale beneath the gothic makeup of his character in The Crow, stepped into position. It was supposed to be routine, just another scene in a film that promised to launch him beyond the long shadow of his father. A prop gun was raised. The trigger was pulled, and in an instant, everything changed. The 31st of March, 1993. The day a movie became a crime scene. The day a wedding turned into a funeral. The day Hollywood lost a young man who had been poised to redefine his legacy. At only 28, Brandon collapsed, a hole torn into his abdomen where no bullet should have been. By dawn the next morning, the headline screamed, "Son of Bruce Lee, dies on set." For millions, the news felt impossible. Brandon was young, vibrant, full of promise. Just days from marrying Eliza Hutton. Just weeks from completing the film that would make him a star. How could his life end not in the chaos of a street fight, not in the danger of stunt work, but in the supposed safety of a film set? The official story spoke of negligence, of corners cut in the rush to finish production. But for those who remembered Bruce Lee, his sudden collapse in 1973, at the age of 32, the tragedy felt like an echo. Father and son, both dead before their time, both deaths shrouded in suspicion, both surrounded by whispers of a curse. Was Brandon's death simply a freak accident? Or had fate, or something darker, reached out to silence him, just as it had silenced his father 2 decades earlier? The answer has never been clear. What remains is a haunting parallel: one life extinguished on camera, another off it, both leaving behind not clarity but myth. This is the story of Brandon Lee, a son of legend, a rising star, and the man whose final role blurred the line between performance and prophecy. Brandon Bruce Lee entered the world on the 1st of February, 1965, in Oakland, California, a child who would carry a surname already heavy with myth. His father, Bruce Lee, had by then ignited a cultural revolution, a martial artist whose charisma and philosophy had vaulted him into superstardom. His mother, Linda Lee Cadwell, was fiercely devoted but understood even in those early years that her son's life would never be ordinary. From the beginning, Brandon's childhood unfolded under the weight of comparison. Family photographs show a boy with wide eyes clinging to the hand of a man the world saw as invincible. But Bruce Lee, though adored on screen, was a relentless perfectionist at home. He trained constantly, fought constantly, moved constantly. Brandon grew up in the rhythm of that intensity. Punches and kicks were as natural in the household as bedtime stories. Yet beneath the laughter and discipline, there was also pressure, unspoken, but always present. Then came 1973. Bruce Lee, only 32, collapsed in Hong Kong. The official cause was cerebral edema, swelling of the brain. The world mourned, conspiracy theories swirled. And Brandon, just 8 years old, learned what it meant to lose a father, not just to death but to mystery. His life was split in two, before the silence and after. From that moment, he was no longer simply Brandon. He was the son of Bruce Lee, a title he would never shed. Linda, widowed at 28, moved her children Brandon and his younger sister Shannon back to the United States. They settled in Seattle and later Los Angeles, where she hoped to give them something like a normal life. But normal was elusive. Brandon was restless, volatile, a boy who both idolized and resented the father he could barely remember. Teachers described him as brilliant but easily distracted, a child who rebelled against authority. Perhaps he sensed already that rules would never apply to him the way they did to others. By adolescence, Brandon's restlessness turned to defiance. He was expelled from high school more than once, fought in classrooms, drifted into crowds that did not know what to make of him. His mother worried, but friends saw in him a fierce energy, reckless, yes, but also magnetic. He was handsome in a way that echoed Bruce but carried his own edge, less polished, more dangerous. What kept him anchored was the very discipline he had once resisted: martial arts. Brandon studied with instructors who had once trained under his father. Though he inherited Bruce's agility and power, his style was different, looser, more improvisational, less bound by form. Still, no matter how hard he tried to define himself, the comparisons returned like a tide. Every punch was measured against Bruce. Every kick was weighed against a ghost. There was another inheritance too, one less visible but equally powerful: fear. From the day of his father's death, whispers of a Lee family curse followed him. Some believed Bruce had been targeted by rivals. Others said he had defied forces larger than himself. Brandon grew up with the chilling awareness that people saw him not as a boy, not even as a man, but as a prophecy waiting to unfold. And yet, beneath the shadow, Brandon longed for ordinary things. He loved music, cars, the wild freedom of riding his motorcycle through Los Angeles streets. He wrote poetry in notebooks, sketches of a soul that craved meaning. He wanted, above all, to live not as a myth, not as a headline, but as himself. The tragedy of Brandon Lee's origin is that he never had the luxury of being ordinary. From birth, his story was intertwined with one larger than his own, the legend of Bruce Lee, and the silence that legend left behind. By the time Brandon Lee reached adulthood, the legend of his father had grown to mythic proportions. Bruce Lee had become more than a man. He was a cultural icon, a symbol of strength, philosophy, and rebellion. And that made Brandon's path both illuminated and obscured. Everyone knew his name, but few were willing to see him apart from the shadow it carried. Hollywood in the 1982nd was not a welcoming place for an Asian American actor, even one with the last name Lee. Casting directors told him openly he was too Asian for mainstream roles, yet not Asian enough to embody the exotic stereotypes they were comfortable selling. The irony cut deep. His father had smashed barriers, only for Brandon to discover that those barriers had been quietly rebuilt. Early on, Brandon took what he could get. Small television roles, martial arts demonstrations, fight choreography, none of it satisfied him, but all of it kept him in the orbit of an industry that seemed determined to keep him at its edges. Friends recalled his frustration, the scripts that reduced him to a thug, a sidekick, or a nameless fighter destined to lose. He wanted more than to be a silhouette behind someone else's spotlight. At the same time, he struggled privately with his own temper and volatility. Teachers and directors alike described him as charismatic but restless. He could light up a room, but he could also erupt when he felt diminished or misunderstood. It was the same fire that had consumed his teenage years, now carried into his 20s, a strength that could dazzle on screen, but a weakness that threatened to close doors just as they opened. Still, there were glimmers of the star he could become. In 1986, Brandon landed a television role in Kung Fu, the movie, playing the son of the very character his father had once been denied the chance to portray. The symbolism was rich, too rich, perhaps. Critics noted the irony, and Brandon himself bristled at the idea that he was merely fulfilling his father's unfulfilled destiny. Yet it was a beginning, proof that he could hold his own on camera. What followed was a series of auditions, near misses, and the slow grind of proving himself. He trained relentlessly, not only in martial arts but in acting. He studied theater, read plays, practiced scenes with an intensity that reminded some of Bruce. But where his father had embraced philosophy and control, Brandon sought raw emotion. He wanted his performances to feel lived in, not choreographed. His acting coaches saw in him not just potential but hunger, the need to be taken seriously, to break free from comparisons, to stand alone. His first true breakthrough came in 1992 with Rapid Fire. Cast as the lead in a modern action thriller, Brandon finally had the chance to showcase both his physical skill and his screen presence. The film was modestly successful, but more importantly, it introduced audiences to Brandon Lee, the actor, not just Bruce Lee's son. Critics praised his charisma, noting his ability to balance vulnerability with ferocity. For the first time, the industry seemed to take him seriously. Behind the spotlight, Brandon's personal life offered stability he had long craved. He met Eliza Hutton, a young woman working in Hollywood as a casting assistant. Their relationship grew quickly, grounded not in fame but in mutual devotion. Friends described Eliza as his anchor, someone who softened his rough edges and reminded him that he could be more than the heir to a curse. They became engaged, planning to marry shortly after the completion of his next film. Yet, even in triumph, shadows lingered. Brandon knew the whispers. He knew that people saw his career as a continuation of his father's unfinished story, that fans spoke of destiny, of curses, of parallels too sharp to ignore. It angered him, but it also haunted him. Was he carving his own path, or was he walking a road already marked by fate? As production began on The Crow, Brandon felt something shift. The role was unlike anything he had played before, dark, poetic, drenched in tragedy. He threw himself into it completely, determined that this would be the film that defined him. And perhaps, in a way that now feels chilling, it did. By the early 1992nd, Brandon Lee's career was finally catching fire. After years of rejection, his performance in Rapid Fire had proven he could lead a film, not just fight in one. The industry began to take notice. His physicality, charisma, and raw edge made him unique, But what struck audiences most was his vulnerability. He wasn't just another action star flexing muscles on screen. He carried a haunted quality, a depth that made viewers lean closer. It was this quality that led director Alex Proyas to cast him as Eric Draven in The Crow, a dark and gothic tale adapted from the cult comic book. The story was bleak, almost Shakespearean. A musician murdered alongside his fiancée, resurrected to avenge their deaths. For Brandon, the role was transformative. It wasn't martial arts. It wasn't a hand-me-down from his father's legacy. It was something entirely his own, a chance to prove that he could carry drama, pathos, and tragedy as powerfully as he carried a punch. On set, Brandon threw himself into the character with an intensity that startled even seasoned crew members. His portrayal of Draven felt both otherworldly and deeply personal. The pale makeup, the long black coat, the hollow stare, it was as though he had been waiting his whole life for this role. Some said he seemed almost possessed, channeling not just a character but something unresolved within himself. Grief for a father he barely knew, defiance against an industry that doubted him, and a longing to prove, once and for all, that he was more than a surname. But the production itself was chaotic, plagued with problems that would later seem ominous. The budget was tight, corners were cut, and safety protocols were often ignored in the rush to stay on schedule. Early into filming, a construction worker was badly burned by an electrical mishap. A crew member impaled his hand with a screwdriver. Equipment malfunctioned with disturbing frequency. To some, these were just the normal hazards of a rushed film shoot. To others, they were signs, bad omens, that the film was cursed. Whispers of a Lee family curse had followed Brandon since childhood, and now they crept back with renewed force. His father's sudden death in 1973 was still clouded in speculation, and many saw eerie parallels in the accidents unfolding around The Crow. Brandon laughed off the rumors in public, dismissing them as tabloid superstition. But privately, friends noticed his unease. He had spoken before about destiny, about how he feared dying young like his father. Playing a man who returns from death only heightened the uneasiness. Meanwhile, tension brewed between Brandon's personal joy and his professional demands. Offset, he was blissfully in love with Eliza Hutton, planning their wedding for the 17th of April, 1993, just days after filming was scheduled to end. He carried photographs of her in his trailer, spoke of the family they would build, the quiet life he longed for away from the cameras. On set, however, he was consumed by the grueling schedule, the stunts, and the eerie atmosphere that seemed to hang over production like a storm cloud. Crew members would later recall that Brandon sometimes looked exhausted, even haunted. He carried the role too close to the bone, one said. It was as if the character and the man had blurred together. Eric Draven was a man who died violently, only to rise again. Brandon was a man who had grown up under the specter of violent death, the son of a legend who had not lived to see middle age. The parallel was unsettling. Still, the performance was undeniable. In dailies, the raw, unedited footage reviewed after shooting Brandon was electric. Studio executives were ecstatic. This wasn't just going to be his breakthrough, it was going to make him immortal. Some even whispered of awards, of a career reborn in fire and shadow. For the first time, Brandon Lee seemed to stand apart from Bruce Lee. He was not an echo. He was a voice. But the darker side of Hollywood is that triumph often courts tragedy. The longer the shoot went on, the more reckless the shortcuts became. Blank cartridges weren't checked carefully. Guns weren't inspected as rigorously as they should have been. Warnings were ignored. And as March 1993 wore on, fate or negligence was circling. By the final week of filming, Brandon was days away from finishing the role that would define him. He was days away from marrying Eliza, days away from proving, to himself and to the world, that he had stepped out of his father's shadow. But destiny, or something that looked very much like it, was waiting. The storm that had been gathering around The Crow was about to break. It was the 31st of March 1993, the final weeks of filming The Crow. Brandon Lee arrived on set that day, as he had countless times before, dressed in black leather, his face painted with the stark white makeup and black streaks that had already become iconic even before the film's release. He was tired but exhilarated. He had spoken to Eliza the night before, promising her that the nightmare pace of filming was almost over. In just a few weeks, they would be married. In just a few months, the world would finally see him not as Bruce Lee's son, but as Brandon Lee, star of a film unlike any other. The scene scheduled for that evening was simple in theory, yet pivotal in the story. Eric Draven, the character Brandon played, walks into his apartment only to be shot by thugs. A prop gun, loaded with blanks, would be fired, the kind of stunt done hundreds of times in Hollywood without incident. Everyone on set knew the stakes. Brandon's performance had been extraordinary, and this sequence would be one of the film's climactic moments. But what no one knew, or perhaps no one had cared enough to check, was that negligence had set a trap. Earlier in the production, real bullets had been used for close-up shots to give the camera a realistic view of cartridges. When they were removed, fragments remained lodged in the barrel of one revolver. Later, blanks were loaded into the same weapon. The combination was deadly. The blank had enough force to dislodge the fragment and turn it into a live round. As cameras rolled, Brandon entered the scene. Actor Michael Massey, playing one of the thugs, raised the revolver. Bang! A sound meant to signal nothing more than cinematic violence. But Brandon staggered, his eyes wide, his hand clutching his abdomen. At first, the crew thought he was improvising, adding realism to the scene. Then he collapsed. Panic erupted. Calls for medics. Someone shouted for an ambulance. Blood spread across Brandon's shirt, staining the costume that was supposed to symbolize vengeance and rebirth. He was rushed to New Hanover Regional Medical Center in Wilmington, North Carolina. Eliza, miles away, received the kind of phone call no fiancé should ever hear. Brandon had been shot, and it wasn't a scene anymore. For hours, surgeons fought to save him. They worked tirelessly, cutting, stitching, transfusing. Outside, cast and crew gathered in silence, some praying, others staring into space as though refusing to believe what had just happened. By 1:04 a.m., the announcement came. Brandon Lee, 28 years old, was dead. The shock hit like an earthquake. News outlets erupted with headlines that read like déjà vu. Bruce Lee's son dies at 28. Fans and journalists alike drew the connection immediately. Bruce Lee, dead at 32. His passing still clouded in mystery. Now Brandon, dead on the cusp of his breakthrough, in circumstances so bizarre they sounded like fiction. The whispers of a curse roared back to life. Investigators combed through the evidence. They determined the tragedy was the result of a chain of negligence, cost-cutting, poor safety checks, the use of live ammunition where there never should have been. It was a tragedy, yes, but also a preventable one. Yet Hollywood, ever wary of scandal, rushed to brand it an accident. Charges were never filed. Lawsuits faded quietly. And in the silence, suspicion grew. Eliza Hutton was devastated. In one cruel night, she lost the man she loved, the wedding she had dreamed of, the future she had built in her heart. Linda Lee, Brandon's mother, was forced to endure a horror she had already known once, burying another Lee, another man claimed in youth, another son swallowed by mystery. For the cast and crew, The Crow was transformed from a film into a eulogy. Every frame Brandon had shot became precious, every line of dialogue an echo of a voice silenced too soon. The studio, after hesitation, chose to finish the film using stunt doubles and digital trickery. Not to exploit his death, they said, but to honor his work. When it was finally released, audiences around the world wept as they watched a story about a man returning from death, knowing the actor had not. And so, the night of the 31st of March became more than just a tragedy, it became legend. Brandon Lee's final moments blurred the line between cinema and reality, between performance and fate. A man playing a character who dies violently was killed violently while playing him. The screen could no longer contain the story. Hollywood called it an accident. Fans called it a curse. The truth, perhaps, lies somewhere between. What is certain is this: the gun that should never have fired did fire. And with that single shot, a life ended, a love story was broken, and a myth was born. The morning after Brandon Lee's death, the world awoke to headlines that seemed ripped from a tragedy too surreal to believe. Newspapers carried photographs of the young actor, his dark eyes now frozen in memory, his life summarized in cruel brevity. Son of Bruce Lee, killed on movie set. For fans of cinema, for those who had mourned Bruce Lee 20 years earlier, the shock felt like a haunting. History had repeated itself not in detail, but in essence. A Lee, full of promise, cut down in youth, surrounded by whispers of fate and mystery. The funeral took place in Seattle, where Brandon was laid to rest beside his father in Lakeview Cemetery. Hundreds gathered, family, friends, actors, and fans. Eliza Hutton stood silent, a bride without a wedding, clutching the memory of a love that had been days away from fulfillment. Linda Lee, his mother, carried the unbearable weight of burying not just her husband, but now her son. Hollywood stars sent flowers, but the atmosphere was heavy with disbelief. The Lee family grave, already a site of pilgrimage for admirers of Bruce, became doubly sacred, a monument to both father and son claimed by destiny's cruelty. For the cast and crew of The Crow, grief was complicated by obligation. The film was incomplete, with vital scenes left unfinished. The studio debated whether to shut it down entirely. To release it as is felt exploitative. To abandon it felt like erasing Brandon's final work. The decision was agonizing, but ultimately, it was Eliza and Linda who urged completion. The Crow should live, they insisted, because Brandon's work deserved to be seen. The process of finishing the film became both technical and spiritual. Stunt doubles stood in for Brandon's body. Early digital effects were used to reconstruct his presence. Every frame was handled with reverence, as though touching sacred ground. Cast members later said it felt less like filmmaking and more like mourning each scene, not an act of creation, but of memorial. When The Crow was released in May 1994, it was more than a movie, it was an elegy. Audiences entered theaters knowing the man on screen was gone, that his final performance was both art and epitaph. The effect was electric. Brandon's portrayal of Eric Draven, a man murdered, returning from death to avenge love, lost took on a chilling resonance. Lines that might have been forgotten instead seared into memory. It can't rain all the time. His every movement, his every glance, carried the weight of prophecy. Critics hailed his performance as magnetic, haunting, unforgettable. The film became a cult classic, not merely for its gothic style or bleak beauty, but because it captured something unrepeatable, a man channeling life, death, and destiny all at once. Brandon Lee had wanted to prove he was more than Bruce Lee's son. In The Crow, he did. He became something singular, tragic, eternal. Yet even in triumph, the shadows lingered. Investigations concluded the shooting was the result of negligence, improper handling of firearms, cost-cutting, and a failure to follow basic safety protocols. But for fans, the explanation felt too thin. How could so many failures align so perfectly to take the life of a man destined for greatness? Conspiracy theories blossomed, sabotage, mafia involvement, even supernatural forces linked to the so-called Lee family curse. Hollywood dismissed them, but the public imagination refused to let go. For Eliza, there was no conspiracy, only heartbreak. She withdrew from the spotlight, her life permanently marked by what could have been. For Linda, the pain was unbearable, but she channeled it into preserving her son's and husband's legacies, ensuring their stories remained alive not just in rumor, but in history. And for audiences, redemption came not in answers but in remembrance. Brandon Lee may have been denied the years his talent deserved, but his presence endures in film, in myth, in the strange way tragedy sometimes immortalizes those it consumes. His death ensured that The Crow would never be forgotten. His life ensured that the man behind the makeup was more than a curse, more than a surname. Brandon Lee did not rise from the grave like Eric Draven. But in cinema, he never truly left. In the end, Brandon Lee's story remains suspended between fact and myth, accident and destiny. He was 28 years old, on the edge of love, on the edge of stardom, when one bullet that should never have been there ended everything. The official verdict is negligence, a tragic mistake born of rushed schedules and overlooked safety. Yet the public has never let the word accident rest easily against his name, because the parallels are too sharp. Bruce Lee at 32, collapsing without warning, his death clouded in speculation. Brandon Lee at 28, killed on set in front of rolling cameras, a victim of the very industry that promised him immortality. 2 lives cut short, 2 stories unfinished, both wrapped in the whisper of a Lee family curse. Whether you believe in curses or not, the symmetry is chilling, and it refuses to fade. But beyond myth, Brandon's legacy endures in what he left behind. The Crow is not just a film now, it is a requiem, a haunting performance that keeps him alive in flickering light and shadow. His portrayal of Eric Draven is raw, poetic, and unforgettable, and through it, he proved what he had always longed to prove, that he was more than his father's son. He was Brandon Lee, a man of passion, talent, and vulnerability, a man who loved deeply and fought fiercely for his own name. At Lakeview Cemetery in Seattle, his grave lies beside Bruce's, the 2 markers side by side like bookends to a story both glorious and cruel. Fans still come, leaving flowers, letters, and whispers of gratitude. They come not just for martial arts or movies, but for what the Lees represent: brilliance, fragility, and the reminder that no light, no matter how bright, is guaranteed to last. And so the question remains, unresolved. Was Brandon's death simply a freak accident, or was it fate repeating itself, a curse too powerful to escape. Perhaps the truth will never be known. What is certain is this: Brandon Lee's life was brief, but his presence lingers. On screen, in legend, and in the eerie silence between a father and son who both left too soon.